Hey everybody, welcome back. Where you place your instrument amplifier on stage, particularly bass guitar amps, can affect your tone. It can affect how it's perceived in the audience and how you hear it on stage. I'd like to share a funny story with you, and then we'll get into the science. So I'm working at this bar. It's a small bar, restaurant venue. It holds maybe 250, 275 people in the room, and a band comes in. Now I'm on the far end of the room where the mixing board is, and the band's on the opposite end of the room where the stage is. And as the band's coming in, I see the bass guitar player dragging in this ridiculous bass rig. I think he was using a two-wheeler. And when I see this, my initial impression is, oh boy, amateur hour. Now, having said that, I've worked with plenty of musicians who drag out ridiculous, enormous guitar rigs, and they are good musicians, and they put on good shows, and they don't give me any trouble at all as a sound guy. But my experience has taught me that a lot of times when people bring out a ridiculous amount of gear, it probably means they don't gig too often. I'm just thinking of my own perception, which is if I was playing a gig every Friday and Saturday night and that was a regular thing for me, I think I'd pretty soon tired of doing 3 or 4 trips out to the trailer to drag a whole bunch of crap in when I could just bring in a small amp in one hand, a guitar in the other, and a bag over my shoulder and be done with it. Why work so hard? But anyway, so this guy's dragging in this big, enormous bass rig, and I'm thinking, oh boy. And sure enough, once the band starts playing, he is just crazy loud. No PA for you. So I'm at the back side of the room, and this guy is just shaking tables with his bass. And the show sounds terrible, of course, and the venue people are giving me the stink eye saying, turn this crap down, will you? But it's, I can't turn it down, and you come from me, it's the guy up on stage. So after a couple of songs of this, I go up to the guy on stage, and I pantomime a little bit and go, bring it down a little bit, please. He ain't having any of that. He just shakes his head and brushes me off like, piss off. Okay, so what can I do? Well, but the only thing I could do is I could try to lift the rest of the band to match his level so I get a decent mix. But that's really not a possibility because do I have enough PA system to lift the band up to meet his level? Yeah, I probably do. But if I was to do that, it would be about as comfortable as putting your head into the exhaust of a jet engine. It would be so loud in there that the bartenders couldn't get drink orders, and undoubtedly the venue owner would be screaming at me to turn it down. So that's not an option. So what can I do except let it roll? When the band takes a break, I slide up to stage and say, hey, I don't mean to tell you how to do your business, but that bass, man, it's really killing me. It's really hot. Can you please bring it down a notch? A good notch, a big notch. We really got to come down a level because you're shaking drinks on the far side of the bar with that thing. The bass player gives me this look like I'm a little bit crazy, and he goes, what are you talking about? I can hardly even hear myself. I got to turn up. I'm turning up on second set. I'm thinking, oh, that's exactly not what we need to do right now. And so I'm eyeing over this situation, and I said, I think I know what's happening here. I think I understand. But I got to hear this. You mind if I step up on stage, and can you just play a couple of quick riffs so I can hear what you're hearing on stage? Get up on stage, guy throws on his guitar, and throws down some bass riffs, and he's right. You could hear it, but it wasn't like overpowering on stage. It was actually pretty mellow on stage, but my goodness, you get off stage, you get into the middle of the back of that room, and it was killing. And so I said, okay, here's what's going on. The physical placement of this amplifier on stage and the boundaries of the room, the dimensions of the room, are just not a good combination right now. So what we need to do is to move you a little bit. Let's try to nudge you one way or the other a couple few feet here, and so we can work a little better with the shape of the room so that you get better bass reproduction up here on stage and you can hear yourself clearly without putting out quite so much juice. And he's like, what? Screw that, I ain't moving shit. I'm going to turn up. Well, yeah, you can turn up all you want, and I don't think you're going to beat the room. You know, when you fight physics, physics tends to win. So, let's talk about how sound travels through the room. We know it travels through the room through waves of air pressure. And those waves of sound are not too unlike water waves. So if we were to look at the side of the waves of water, if you threw a pebble into a pond, it would look probably something like this. So this would be a pure tone, a very simple wave. And as you know, waves have crests and peaks and so forth. And this is made by the loudspeaker moving out and pulling back in and moving out and pulling back in, creating a sound pressure front. Now, of course, in music or speech or the things we normally listen to, the wavefronts are going to be a little more complicated than this because they have harmonics, which will be smaller waves that ride on top of this and so forth. But if we were just to hit a low bass tone, a nice pure boom tone, it would be something akin to that. And the question is, how big are these waves in the room? Now, we can't see them, of course, but we can definitely measure them. And we can figure out what the wave size is going to be physically by the frequency of the sound and how fast sound travels through air. But if this is a 60 hertz wave, which is about as low of a frequency as you can go on a bass guitar, one wave cycle will be about 18 feet. So if we start at the 0 point and do one complete wave and go to the next 0 point around there, this distance will be about 18 feet. And if the room was some size that was not divisible by 18 feet, that wave would propagate across the room and at some point kind of fold back upon itself and continue to bounce around off of the walls and floors and ceiling surfaces and hard objects and sort of scatter throughout the room. Now, as we go up in the frequency range from bass to treble, these waves get smaller and smaller and smaller until at the very highest frequencies, which would be the harmonics of the cymbals, the highest tones that we can hear, we're in the range of an inch or two. Through much of the audio range, we're dealing with waves of a few inches to a couple of feet. But in the bass region, we start talking about waves in multiple feet. And we have room dimensions that are also multiple feet. And so if our room happened to be 18 feet side to side in some dimension, this wave would comfortably fit right in that dimension. And it would tend to just hang right there. That's called a standing wave, because the wave would have its peaks and null points and valleys, which would tend to stay in approximately the same spot in the room. if the room dimensions supported that particular frequency well. And so if we were to cut this wave into 1/4, we should slice it right here, and right here, and right here. These are the places of greatest impact of the wave, because in this one we have the maximum amount of output. This one we have the maximum amount of output on the bottom side. And right here we have a null which has no output. And so if we had a room that was about 18 feet with this particular tone, and we stood in the middle of the room, we would be standing in a null. And in a null, it looks like there is about 0 energy right there. And so what we would experience is if we went 4 feet in from the room, well, 4 to 5 feet from the wall, the bass would sound really strong. And then we go another 4 to 5 feet to the middle point, and we'd approach a null where the bass gets really weak. And then as we move another 4 to 5 feet, the bass would once again become really strong. Now, of course, we're playing different notes, and so these things are going to slide around a little bit. But you get the idea that the dimensions of the room will have an impact on how the bass flows within that room at different locations. And likewise, what can happen is, depending upon where your instrument amplifier is and where the nearby wall surfaces are, the sound can come off of that amplifier, impact the wall surface, and bounce back to you. And when two waves collide, they can interact with each other. So if you have a wave, like so, and then we have a second wave which is come off the amplifier, hit the wall, and rejoined us again, and it happens to be opposite in phase. Oh my goodness. This is not art school. Remember that. This is sound engineering school, god dang it. If we have another wave that was out of phase with the first one, so this one's coming off your amp, this one's coming off the wall, because it hit the wall and came right back at you, you'll notice that they are opposite to each other, and when you add this to this, the result is 0. And same thing here, and so the resulting wave is nothing. They cancel each other out. And so, at the point mechanically in the room where these two waves meet each other up, they would more or less cancel each other out, and it would sound pretty quiet. Now, of course, if we just nudge things over a couple feet, maybe 4 feet or so, that would slide one of these over, and it might be more close to in phase with this one. And now where we got a plus and a plus, they go together and it gets even bigger yet. And minus to minus, they join together and gets bigger yet. And so in that case, they would work together and amplify the sound. And so because of this, because of the interaction with the walls, it acts like multiple points of energy. The waves will either work with each other or against each other, and you're going to have hot and cold spots in the room where bass is reinforced or attenuated. Now, of course, the same situation is happening with your PA subwoofers. And so the question is, where should we put our amplifiers or our PA subwoofers? And I can't give you any complete absolute rules. I can't tell you to break out the slide rule and start working some math on this one, because it's a little bit like predicting the weather. Now, yes, you can go into a room, you can measure all the dimensions, you can look at the absorption of various items in the room, and you can do some modeling, which can be simplistic or really complicated to try to model the behavior of that room. Now, of course, once you get 150 people in there who are also absorbing sound, well, the equations change a little bit, don't they? So there's a lot of factors involved, and doing an extremely accurate modeling of what's going to happen is complicated and probably not something that you can just quickly do on the fly. But there are some basic ideas that you can pursue. One is obviously trial and error. If you throw your bass amp down and you're not getting really strong, powerful tone out of it, move it over 5 feet, or move yourself over 5 feet, and see if things change. And likewise, if it's possible, if you have wireless, maybe you can take a real quick stroll around the important areas of the venue to make sure that your bass is coming through nice and solid. The other thing that I would often suggest is if your stage is here, and you got a wall behind you, and maybe a wall over there, try to either put your instruments as close to the boundary surfaces as you can. Right in the corner is usually a really good spot to put bass instruments, because it'll just be reinforced by these two walls, and you can get several dB more output for free by just putting it right in the corner. And if it's right butted up tight against the corner, you're not going to have issues with the wave fronts rejoining each other out of phase and canceling each other out. It'll help reinforce the bass. So likewise, instead of putting the amplifier on the stage, I'd rather see you put it right back against the wall. So you can give that a try to try to reinforce the output rather than cancel it out. Now, having said all of this, this is to say that where you put your instrument amplifier is going to work with or against you depending upon its location in the room. And that's assuming that your amplifier is putting out a bunch of sound. Now, in my ideal world, as a sound guy, I would prefer to see the band not generating a whole lot of sound on stage. My best experiences are with those bands where the musicians plug in their instruments directly, and they use in-ear monitors, and we don't have stage monitors, and so the stage is very quiet, and we don't have any of these issues. Now, we might have some of those issues with the PA system and its subwoofers, but at that point it's my problem, not the musicians. Now, I know that's not for everybody. I've worked with bands who have gone to in-ears with all direct instruments, and some of the bands say they love it and they'd never go back. They say, for the first time I can really hear myself clearly. Everybody in the band has a tablet or their phone, and they can use that to exactly dial in the monitor mix that they want. And by using the guitar amp simulator emulator board, I can plug in all kinds of different guitar sound patches. So as I go from song to song, I can have a guitar that sounds just like that Rolling Stones guitar, or just like that Van Halen guitar at the push of a button. And I can get all of those patches dialed up so that their level is even as I go from one sound to the next to the next. And so by doing an all direct in-ear type of stage setup, band gets really consistent sound, and you don't have sound splash from instrument amplifiers or from stage wedges getting up into the vocal mics, creating more muddy, indistinct sounds. It sounds really good to the audience, and the band has great monitoring. But there are other musicians who would say that I'm just not comfortable playing with in-ears in. It just doesn't sound quite natural. I feel isolated from everything going on, and it's just not a comfortable way to work. And, or, the instrument sounds that we get by doing that, they just aren't as good. You know, if you want the sound of a proper tube-type Marshall amp or a Vox amp or whatever you like, an emulation of that is always going to be second best. The best sound is from the real thing. Can't argue with that. And I would say that's probably even more important on drums. I've heard some pretty good electronic drum sounds. But having said that, to me they always have some electronic drum sound to them. I've never heard electronic drums that really, truly, to me, sound like the real thing. And that especially goes for cymbals. There are some E-drum cymbals which aren't too bad, but none of them have the tone that a really good metal cymbal has. Of course, having said that, one of the good things about E-drums is that you can control the level. And you can also make sure that the level of the cymbals and the toms are well controlled. A lot of drummers will have cymbals which are quite a bit louder than the toms. And in a small venue situation, that can sometimes be a handful, unless the drummer has really good dynamic control. So there's pluses and minuses. But if you're going to be producing sound on stage from your instruments, keeping in mind that the place you put them on the stage can have an impact on the sound. Now, we don't have such a issue with higher frequency instruments generally, like lead guitars, drums, and that's simply because the wavelengths involved are much smaller. And so because of those smaller wavelengths, they tend to propagate through the room and get into corners and just sort of fill in more evenly than these really enormous waves that are generated by low-frequency bass instruments, where the bass wavelengths are measured in multiple feet, and that can start really interacting and building standing waves in typical room dimensions. And so, if you experience unusual hot and cold spots with your bass, try moving yourself or try moving the source of that sound by 3 to 6 feet, one way or another, and see if that changes the game. I bet in a lot of cases it probably will for you. So we've talked about all this boundary interaction and how it can cause us trouble. But what if we could just simply get rid of the boundary? That would be a solution. And there's some options for that. One of them is to put sound-absorbing material on the wall. So when sound hits the wall, it doesn't reflect off the wall and act as a boundary surface and create another wavefront that collides with our primary wavefront, and it doesn't interact with our original sound source. And so we could put sound-absorbing material up, such as sound-absorbing panels. Or we could hang some heavy curtains. We could hang some moving blankets. That's a pretty cost-effective approach. Or we could put up 6 inches or 8 inches of fiberglass on the wall. And all of these things can be effective at controlling the reflections coming off the wall. But they're really only effective at high frequencies. When you get into the subwoofer territory, those deep low frequencies, that kind of energy is really hard to absorb with materials like that. There are some tools such as bass traps, which are tuned devices that actually absorb bass energy, and you can put those into the corners or strategic places in the room. But that's usually an engineering-driven solution. And so it's pretty hard to make the boundary disappear on low-frequency sounds. But for higher frequency stuff, you can hang blankets or curtains in your practice space and probably calm down the space quite a bit for the mid-range and the high-frequency elements. Now, the other thing you can do is you can get into a bigger space. If the boundary surfaces are multiple wavelengths away, they have a whole lot less interaction. Unfortunately, we're dealing with some pretty big wavelengths. We're dealing with 10 or 20 foot waves. And so if we need to get multiple wavelengths away, well, we're probably talking about pushing those walls and surfaces away from us by 50 feet, 100 feet. And at that point, they really don't interact too much with what's going on. And so you could move into a really large space, and maybe the biggest space that's available to most of us is the great outdoors. So when you do an outdoor show, you don't have these issues. And, well, you do with the ground, but other than the ground, you don't have any other side walls to worry about or ceilings. And this is why when I'm tuning up my PA system and I'm trying to get a baseline equalization, I'll set up my system outdoors in a location that's away from all the buildings and vehicles and stuff. Just a nice flat field is ideal. And so I'll set up the system outdoors, and I'll crank up some pink noise, break out the calibration mic, and I will calibrate the equalization of the system so that I'm getting flat response in that environment, which is as close as I can get practically to an anechoic environment, a non-echoey environment, anechoic. And that will give me the baseline EQ, which I can then tweak once I get into a venue and have to make adjustments for that particular space that I'm in. It's also why I'm a big fan of outdoor shows, provided that the weather's cooperative. They tend to sound really good because I don't have to fight with the room at all. Now, all of these things that I've talked about with your bass amplifier on stage and its placement and the interaction of the room also, of course, apply equally to subwoofers in your PA system. And a couple of quick subwoofer tips for you. Oftentimes, I'll see bands with speaker stacks on either side of the stage. So you've got your stage, and I'll see the band will put up their PA stacks on either side of the stage. Now, we have two sound sources that are going to work together or against each other, depending upon distance. And when you do this, a typical effect that happens is power alley, which is where these two subwoofers join forces together and create a zone down the middle of the audience where you get powerful, strong bass. But once you move over a little bit, and so you're getting the sound from this subwoofer just a little bit before this one, those two wavefronts start to get slightly out of phase with each other, and they start having cancellation effects. And so you might find that if you go off to the side of that center region, you get into an area of null where we have poor bass or weaker bass. And then as we slide over a little bit more, now we're getting more in phase again, and so we have an area of strong bass through here. And then as we move over a little more, we get into another null zone. And so you can check this out if you go to a band and listen to their show and they're driving both subwoofers, and just walk horizontally along the stage here in front. And you may hear that there are spots where the bass gets really strong and a little weak and really strong and a little weak and so forth. It's power alley. If I'm in a venue that isn't super large and I have plenty of extra headroom in the PA system to cover it, what I might do is kill one of those woofers and just unplug that subwoofer. Because that way I now only have a single point source. I don't have two sources that are fighting with each other, and everything coming off of this woofer will provide evenly distributed bass throughout the area. And you can usually get away with this because our ear brain is not too good at localizing the source of deep low frequency sounds. We have two ears in our head that are separated by a little bit of space, and because of that, when a sound comes in, our ear brain can determine where it's coming from. The sound's coming from over here, it hits this ear first, and a moment later this one. And our ear and brain system can work with that small time delay from when it hits one ear to the next to tell us that the sound is coming from over there. But when we're dealing with low frequency bass sounds, those wavelengths are so large that the wavefront that hits us hits both of our ears at practically the exact same time. And because of that, we're just not too good at figuring out exactly where that low frequency bass energy is really coming from. So, given that, you can run a single subwoofer, which will give you smooth coverage throughout the venue, and for the most part, people won't really be too clued into the fact that you're only running one woofer. Sure, as you walk toward this one, you'll notice that it gets a little louder, but you'll have nice smooth bass coverage throughout the whole venue. Now the other tip I want to give you is that I would suggest, if possible, to put your subwoofers on the ground, on the floor. Lots of times we have a stage that is elevated off the floor. Let's put a drum kit up here. Maybe a couple of instrument amps. Remember, not art school. And sometimes I will see people put their PA loudspeakers on the edge of stage. Well, this isn't really a great idea if you can avoid it, because you now have a boundary surface on the floor and you've put your loudspeaker, let's say 4 or 5 or 6 feet above this boundary. And as we know, 4 or 5, 6 feet is right around where a quarter wavelength of our deep bass frequencies reside. And so this is going to cause reinforcement and cancellation of bass tones right in that operating region of our subwoofers. So by putting your speakers onto the stage, you're likely going to have some pretty major irregularities in your deep bass response. And you do much better if you were to just move these guys down so they're alongside the stage and able to couple with the floor and not have a boundary surface 4 feet away from the woofer or 6 feet away. So a couple quick tips for your subwoofer placement. Hope you found this tech tip interesting. Click the subscribe button, join the channel, and if you click that bell icon, you'll be notified of new content when it drops.